Buenos dias. Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to Buenos Aires, and it's a beautiful city. And unfortunately, my team did not win its football match. Otherwise we would be playing you guys on Saturday. But I wish now Argentina good luck for its football match on Saturday. So I will be talking about the are pediatric allergies on the rise, and are they getting more persistent? So this is the basic idea of the hygiene hypothesis, that allergies are on the rise. Now, this is data that's been around now for a while, that the rise not only in allergies, but many other diseases, whether it's Crohn's disease, type 1 diabetes, asthma, have all risen in the last 50 to 70 years, while lots of infectious diseases have gone down. So whether it's hepatitis, measles, mumps, have all decreased. And this is now focusing a little more on allergies, but whether you think of allergies of seasonal allergies, which is hay fever in the green, or asthma in the blue, or eczema or atopic dermatitis in the orange, they have all gone up in the last 20 years, and you can see it's not localized to the United States and Europe, but even here in Argentina, it's less common than the United States, but still everywhere you've looked, it's been on the rise. And we're really going to focus more on food allergy, since this is a food allergy symposium. So has it risen in the United States for food allergies? So on the graph, let me see, make sure my pointer working, yes. So here you can see this is the number of children with food allergies in the United States that has really risen from 3% to 5% in the last 10 years. And these are the most common food allergies, which I understand is a little bit different here in Argentina, but it's about 2% with milk, which is, I was told, it's about the same here in Argentina. But we have a lot more peanut allergy compared to we have it here in Argentina. So just some basic facts about food allergy and how common it is in the United States. It's about 1 in 13 children in the United States, and it has increased about 50%. According to our Center for Disease Controls, which is one of the big prevalence data that we have in the United States. Oops, let me go back, hit the wrong button there. And not only the United States, but this is looking at admissions for how severe the reactions are. They've gone up about sevenfold in the last 10 years in Europe. And this is the number of hospital discharge admissions in the United States from 1995, where it was about 2 per thousand. The 2 now is up to 9. It's a large number increased number of hospital admissions for asthma, for food allergies in the last 10 years. So it really has risen dramatically. The other thing, not only has food allergies risen, but they've also appear to be changing. So they're becoming more persistent. So the second half of the question, are they rising? Are they becoming more persistent? And the answer is suggestingly yes. So this is just data from 3 different studies, looking from 1998, 2005, and the most recent study from the COFAR group, which is the large consortium in the United States, in 2012. And this is the rate of how many people are still allergic to milk. So back in 10 years ago, 1998, there was maybe about 70% of the kids outgrew milk allergy by 2, and by 9, almost everyone is gone. But the most recent data in 2012, as you can see, at 2, only 20% still had milk allergy, compared to now at 9, 50% still had milk allergy, suggesting that it's changing rapidly. This is a rapid change, that food allergy in these studies are becoming more persistent. And this is just looking at that data from the COFAR group from Bob Wood that looked at the prevalence of food allergy and how more persistent it is in the United States. And again, this is sort of looking at the curve in the opposite way. Now, this is the probability of still having milk allergy, and this is now the age in months, that you can see at 1 year of age, about 80% still had milk allergy, and by 3 years of age, it's about 60%. When I started my training, about 20 years ago, we thought by 3 years of age, everyone outgrew it. Now, at 6 years of age, it was about 50% of the age group still had milk allergy. So things appear to be changing. or maybe we're getting better, and so either things are changing or we're getting better information. Tough to tell yet. But the question is, why? What's this changing? What's the big change? And this is all part of what we call the hygiene hypothesis. And I'm just going to go over some of the facts behind the hygiene hypothesis and trying to sort of tease out what's probably real, what's not, and why things are changing so fast, because this is a very fast change. So hygiene hypothesis is sort of this idea that things that were too clean, and if everything's been blamed, from running water to TVs and computers, too many pediatricians, children are born in the hospital, we're too stuck in cars and traffic, we're eating everything out of the microwave or using plastic and prepackaged foods, or there's just generally we're knowing a lot more, so maybe it's just much more information. The idea of the whole hygiene hypothesis comes back from a study from David Strachan back in 1989. This was a study of about 17,000 children in England from 1958, and they followed them for 23 years. And they looked at the self-report of seasonal allergies or hay fever. And what they found was the more children that you had in your household, the least likely that you were to have either allergies at the age of 11, gone from 10% down to 2, or allergies at the age of 23, down from 20 down to 8. And he thought it was this idea of they had less infections because they're getting colds and everything else from their siblings. The whole idea of the hygiene hypothesis. So now, I'll go over some other brief data suggesting this is true, and then we'll go over sort of where the faults are, where the issues are. So this is data, again, published in the United States about looking at a public database of about 34,000 individuals looking at allergies. So this is looking at hepatitis A. So if you were positive to hepatitis A, you were very unlikely to get it from back over almost a century now, while it has risen in the last 30 years, from this is 40s, 50s, and the 60s. So if you were negative to hepatitis A, you were much more likely. So back here, the hepatitis A didn't matter, but there's something now. This suggests there's some marker of things going on. So this is other data looking at now not only for allergies, but looking at type 1 diabetes, which has also risen. It's all part of this hygiene hypothesis. So the areas in yellow are areas where there's high rates of hygiene hypothesis, of type 1 diabetes, the United States and Canada, most of Europe, Australia. And the areas in red are areas where they have high rates of what we call chronic infectious diseases like leprosy and schistosomiasis and various helminth infections. And as you can see, areas really don't overlap at all, suggesting that one thing was protecting against the other, the whole point of the hygiene hypothesis. And some other evidence to suggest this would be true is this data out of using antibiotics. So this is some meta-analysis of various different studies done throughout the world looking at more frequent use of antibiotics, suggesting using antibiotics you're more likely to have infections. So if you had 4 or more courses of antibiotics, up here this is 3 or 4, 1 and 2. So if suggesting that these antibiotics are changing things, and these suggesting if more use of antibiotics, the more likely you are going to have developing childhood asthma. So whether it's here, this is a ratio about 1.5 times when you get 1 course down to 1 time. But the odds ratio, as you can see, are 90%, 94%, suggesting there's a real risk for using lots of antibiotics. Again, overuse of things that were being too clean. So a lot of the data suggests where's this coming from. So this is data out of these European farm studies. So in Europe, they have these large farm studies where they looked at populations living in Europe, and population living on the farm, and living in sort of the city and the suburbs. And in the farm, the children are really sort of raised with the cows. So up this little picture here, the little baby, mom's coming to milk the cow, and there's a cow, the baby just sort of sleeps right next to the cow. And if you lived on the farm, you were much more likely not to have allergies or have less sensitization. So the areas here is just a set, you can see the adjusted risks associated with farming and the parents' work on the farm, significantly less likely to be sensitized to allergens. So these are just looking at specific IgE, even to outdoor allergens or indoor allergens. So they looked at this data more closely now and began to say, okay, is it when do they live and other risk factors that's going on? So they looked at separating the data out. So living on the farm in the first year in life or after the first year in life. And are they having farm milk, so unpasteurized milk, or just regular milk? And what you can see, the rate of having having allergies or being atopic is the best if you lived in the farm and had farm milk. But if you had the farm milk or the stables after 1 year of age, it didn't really matter. If you had no exposure, which is here, there's really no difference whatsoever. So having farm milk but no stables, so you just had early milk, protects a little. So suggesting there's something in the farm milk, the less processed food, that may be playing a role. This is additional data for a different area, again, looking at this whole issue of farm's milk, so unpasteurized milk versus pasteurized milk. So the black bars are unpasteurized milk, and the gray bar here is using unpasteurized milk, using farm milk. So this is sort of the control group. They're all about the same, whether it's unpasteurized or pasteurized milk, but if you live in having unpasteurized milk, and it seems to protect, no matter whether you're in a control group, a farm laborer, or living on the farm. It protects in all three groups. But there was no real, interestingly, there was no difference between the control group and the farm group, at least in this study. So in the US, most people don't live on the farm and live in the farm group, so that people looked, Dennis Owensby did this data when he was up in Michigan, looked at other risk factors. Again, looking at what may be protecting. And this time they looked at the ownership of pets. As an allergist, we were always taught when I started back that having pets at home, you're more likely to be allergic to a thing if you had a dog in your house or a cat in the house. But this data back almost 10 years, over 10 years ago now, looked at having one dog or two dogs. And the more likely you had a dog, having two or more dogs at home really seemed to protect you. So it was one dog protected you a little, and two dogs really protected you a lot. So if you had two or more dogs at home, it seemed to be very protective against both dog allergies, cat allergies, against everything. Seemed to be sort of protective, because one dog had a little protection, but two dogs was really much more protective. And I since have asked them, and they've done the study, it's not little dogs, you need big dogs. So you need two big dogs are much more protective than two little dogs, little pequeño dogs. So then the issue also came up, what other surrogate factors can we use? Can you not have a large family, but going to daycare, sending your kid to daycare, because if you go to daycare, you got lots of infections. So now looking at going to daycare in the first year of life, so these are kids in daycare in the first year of life, really it doesn't make much difference for asthma or recurrent wheezing in this small study, but it protected a little against eczema, and having a diagnosed with a lower respiratory infection, so having an infection sort of lower down your airways, now that says it makes things worse. So there's a little contradiction here, so things don't always follow from one way to the other. So this is the whole idea of the hygiene hypothesis, that if you have high hygiene, so things are clean, unpasteurized milk, using lots of antibiotics, you're more likely to have autoimmune disease, so you don't have these infections, autoimmunity. Your immune system sort of doesn't turn on these cells, and everything is activated. You get more autoimmunity as well as more allergy. While you have low hygiene, sort of things are very clean, pristine. I don't know in Argentina, but in the United States, we have all these moms walk around with Perel, which is this antiseptic alcohol wipe, that take their kids, every time they touch anything, they wipe it and they wash their hands and they clean their hands. Is that true here also in Argentina? Sometimes. So that's the ultra clean, no germs ever. So you have no germs ever, your body's sort of, nothing gets triggered on you here, but you have lots of bugs and germs, your immune system gets turned on and you get induction of the regulatory system that turns everything down. And that's the thought of the hygiene hypothesis. But where's some errors? So one, data out of lots of places have shown if you have these lower respiratory infections, such things from like RSV or influenza or even rhinovirus, you're more risk factor for developing asthma. And then I like to go scuba diving and diving, so I went to Tonga out in the South Pacific. So in Tonga, everyone has a pig, right? So pigs are supposed to be really protective. So this is just walking along the road in Tonga. Here's a pig walking in the street. That's the house. The pig's going to walk through the house. That's what you see in Tonga. But Tonga, the rate of asthma in Tonga is 16%, much higher than the United States, much higher than most of Europe. So being that clean doesn't hold there. Interestingly, nearby in New Zealand, the rate of asthma is almost 30%. So it may be something in that part of the world that puts you at a different risk factor. So it's beyond just the hygiene. There's other things you need as well. And we'll try to tease that apart a little as we go along here. So now, here's this issue of whether do viruses protect or make things worse. So this is data looking at a birth cohort out of Europe and about 1,000 children. So number of lower respiratory infections are here. So if you have a lower respiratory infection, you're much more likely to have asthma. But if you have a viral infection, it's the opposite. So certain viruses, if they just end up in their upper tract, so here they protect, but if they end up in your lower airway, they make you worse. So it's probably a combination of what the virus does to you and sort of who you are genetically. Well, other infections here, whether they looked at bacterial infections, fungal infections, gastrointestinal infections, or courses of antibiotics in this study seems to make no difference. But now this is a study looking in Italy, looking at, in these military candidates, looking at sort of fecal oral infections, so having oral infections like hepatitis A, H. pylori, toxoplasmosis, they protect here, while viral infections do not. So there seems to be a difference. This is sort of Italy and Germany right next to each other, but there was a difference between these two, suggesting that if you have more than one infection, of these infections they protect, while respiratory ones do not. So it seems to be different from one to the other. And these ends are small, so what helps, maybe we can tease this apart a little. And some of this is probably the whole idea of the microbiome. Microbiome in the United States is now the big thing. Everyone's sort of fascinated about the microbiome. And the microbiome is sort of, the more I know about it, the more complicated it gets. You not only have a microbiome in your intestine, you have microbiome on your skin, your nose, your lung, and your skin microbiome varies from your shoulder to your toe. It's slightly different. It's not all the same. Your body seems to have different spots. And I'm sure, as you know, we have more bacteria in our body than we do than cells. So we're basically a big host for bacteria, more than anything else. So some of the data begin to tease apart, do microbiome play a large role? And this was a study done in Scandinavia. So Estonia and Sweden are two countries in Northern Europe. They're right next to each other. Scandinavia is a very high income, very clean country. Estonia was part of Russia, which was sort of poor. But Sweden had lots of allergy. Estonia had very little allergies. But from a genetic standpoint, they're very similar. And when they looked at the gut flora, the microbiome in Estonia, here, they had more of certain bacteria and less of others, so less Clostridia and more Lactobacillus and eubacteria, so there seems to be a difference from one to the other. Now, looking at these farm studies, again, these are the two farm studies out of Germany, and you can see there's the patients living on the farms, whether the children on the farm compared to the reference group, if they had asthma, they had different, this is the asthma rates, and ATP rates in the two studies. The farm, again, were protective from, so living on the farm was protective against asthma or against allergies in general. And if you looked at the bacteria now, this is looking at the bacteria, so you're living on the farm, you had a lot more different types of bacteria compared to the people who had asthma or living on the farm again, much more protective against fungus. So there seems to be a lot more exposure to this microbiome. Then this was this fascinating study that got published a year ago. And they looked at pacifier use. And they asked parents how they clean the pacifier. Do the pacifier, after they clean it, do they stick it in boiling water, or do they falls on the floor, pick it up, mom licks it, gives it back to the kid, right? And so they looked at, again, eczema, asthma, and sensitization being a positive allergy testing. So if you boil the pasta, so this is no pacifier use. If you boiled it, really no difference. But if mom just dropped it, picked it up on the floor and licked it, less eczema, a lot less asthma, and less sensitization is not statistically significant. But so the microflora in mom, or the right cytokines and chemokines that are in the mother's mouth, seems to be protecting. So again, the suggesting is an interesting thing. And then there's this recent study that just got published last month out of in the United States on the inner city. So in the inner city in the United States, there's one of the highest rates of asthma. And the story's like, how does this always fit with the hygiene hypothesis? Because there's a lot of cockroaches and lots of dust and fungus. So there's a lot of things going on that should be a risk factor for allergy, that should be protective. But all these things seem not. So if you look over here, having exposure to cockroach or mice or dog or dust are a significant risk factor. However, if you're exposed to lots of them, so no exposure compared to 3 exposure, that if you're exposed to a lot, you're more likely to be exposed, whether at year 1, year 2, or year 3, that the more exposure you have to these allergens, the more likely you were to have infection. Then they looked at the microbiome of these patients. And they looked at why 1 was bad and 3 were sort of good. The issue is if you had, so I'm going to go through this slide a little carefully now. So M is the microbiome, A is high allergen. So if you have high allergen, low microbiome, that's the green, you are most likely to be atopic, so compared to the other groups, or have wheezing. So this is just looking at microbiome, or sort of the ones we think that are important, the lactobacillus and things like that, are much more likely to be true. But if you had high microbiome and high allergen, you're more likely to be protective. So you need to have both the right microbiome and so you need a lot of exposure to a lot of allergens and exposure to lots of the right microbiome. And if you had neither, no microbiome, which is here, and no allergen, you are most likely, interestingly, you were pretty likely to have both wheezing and be atopic. So that was pretty bad. So you had in that population where you had no exposure to allergen and none of the good protective microbiome, you were in bad shape. So so having both was best, having neither was the worst. So these things are suggesting that these things, the microbiome, these allergens are playing some role to protect things. And we also can prove this in mice. So this is a study done in mice, done by actually one of our new fellows who's coming on. He's worked in David Artis's lab. And what they were able to do is, in a mice, you can make a mice get allergies. It's relatively easy to do. But if you gave mice antibiotics, you make the mice more allergic. Or if you made mice germ-free, you get rid of all the microbiome, you make them more allergic. And if you put the microbiome back, it makes it go away. So in a mouse model, this was a mouse model of food allergy. You can do the same thing for food allergy or asthma, that you can really change the microbiome, you can really change disease to really make protection one way or the other. But can we do any of these things in humans? So there have been lots of people giving probiotics. There are lots of studies that looked at it. And so there have been 14 studies looked at it in the prenatal and the postnatal period. 7 studies showed that it made a difference initially in the first 2 years, but by year 4 and 7, everything should normalize. The other 7 studies had absolutely no difference. People tried bacterial lysates, which is another sort of product, to reduce the number of infections, but no effect really on ATP. It seemed to not protect one way or the other. So why might be some difference? And this is the whole idea of the interaction of the innate immunity versus the immune system. And this all goes through these innate immune receptors called the toll-like receptors. Toll-like receptors, as you can see, the whole family of receptors, and they interact with different members of the sort of microbiome, whether it's bacterial and CpGs go through toll-like 9, double-stranded DNA or RNAs go through toll-like receptor 3, liposaccharides, which we've seen in a lot of bacteria, go through toll-like receptor 4. Now, what about LPS, or lipopolysaccharides? So the studies with that are all over the place. There are 3 studies here, I'm not going to go into detail, that suggest that if you have lots of areas of this endotoxin, LPS, it's protective. Then you've got 3 studies that suggest that high levels of LPS make you more likely to have allergies. So they would 3 positive, 3 negative. How can you sort of understand what was going on? So the toll-like receptor 4 has various parts to it. This receptor that binds to LPS goes through this receptor, going through the membrane, causing activation of the signal through NF-kappa B. But there's also another part of it called CD14 that interacts with this whole receptor that leads to the activation. So CD14 has various genetic changes. It has 3 different molecules. And there seems to be one, the TT seemed to be sort of protective compared to the CT or the CC. It seems to be suggesting there's some protection with this TT compared to the lines. Further analysis showed that it's protective only in certain circumstances. So if you had the TT and low levels of endotoxin, it's protective. While you had the CC one, you needed high levels, suggesting that this microbiome and this whole issue of exposure, you need the right genetics, the right microbiome, and probably also at the right time. So it's a really complex thing as we begin to tend to tease it apart. So what about other things with endotoxins and parasites? Like really now looking at what we know from food allergy. So you can make a mouse allergic again. You can give mouse cholera, which is just a good adjuvant, and your mouse basically will start wheezing, coughing, and having classic signs of food allergy. So if you gave mouse cholera, here, the mice would now get high IgE and lots of histamine, so they became highly allergic, while if you just gave peanut by itself, less likely. You didn't give peanut, they have no symptoms. However, if you did peanut plus helminthic infection, over here, it really made no difference. There was something with the cholera that was promoted allergy, while the helmet seemed to protect. Now, if you gave everything in combination, and this peanut with the cholera, more likely to get allergies, peanut by itself, while you do cholera plus the helminth infection. So it's suggesting that the helminth infection, the parasites begin to protect. So we need, again, the right infection at the right time. So how can things change so fast? Now, this is the new area that there's even less data out there called epigenetics. Now, when we have a DNA, it has various, it comes folded and unfolded. And to express genes, you need to be unfolding. You need the structure. So the idea of epigenetics is you get methylation of DNA that will turn off gene production, or you can get histone modification doing the same things. And we know now that the environmental effects, either from pollutions, plastics, folate, microbiome, various foods, they will either protect or unprotect. So make things worse or make things better. And this can be a very rapid change, because obviously our DNA doesn't change that fast. So how is all these things that we're talking about, the pollutions, the microbiome, having a rise so dramatically in the last 10 years, 20 years, 40 years, causing this dramatic change? And this is the thought, the idea of of epigenetics. So what we know about epigenetics and food allergy? Honestly, very little. There's a couple studies out there. There was one study done by Carrie Nadeau out of Stanford that looked at looking epigenetics in food allergy and in eosinophilic esophagitis, which I'll be talking about later, suggesting that there are changes that you can look at the two populations. Then work out of France now starts doing oral immunotherapy, which is out of Carrie Nadeau's group, or epicutaneous desensitization out of the group out of Paris, showing that you can change the Th2 pathway, change GATA3, So you're less likely to activate Th2 cells. So you really begin to change things from one way to the other. So what do we think happens in these cells? We need not only, you need the right microbiome, you need the possibly consumption of farm milk early on, contact with not multiple, probably not only farm animals, but even dogs, that you need to have light protection, and whether it's through various changes, upregulation in the CD14, toll-like receptors, it seems to protect along those lines. You need the right combination of enough things early on that makes a difference. And it leads to this big interaction that having the right environmental exposures and the right genetic factors and the right microbiome leads to sort of the right balance, but giving induction of your immune system, balancing your decreasing of allergies and then decreasing autoimmune cells. But also plays a role, what about diet? What about really when we introduce foods? Does that play a role? So the risk of allergies is a change when we add foods, and what about foods being allerged? What are foods being exposed? Does it matter when we introduce foods? Do we need to avoid foods while they're breastfeeding or having breastfeeding itself or during pregnancy? Should mom change her diet? Should we use a different formula? Or should we add foods at a different time? When I started 10 years ago, or not 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when we looked at, we would say no high-risk foods, whether it's milk or egg or peanut, till 4. We don't want to give peanut in the United States to 4, because that would make you less likely to have allergies. Was that good advice? Did that make sense? If we had no egg to 18 months, did that change the way we do things? So what's the data behind it? So first of all, let's start from the pregnancy and go forward. So does avoiding food during pregnancy make a difference? So there have been 5 studies that looked at avoidance of milk and egg during pregnancy. Made no difference. One way it had no effect whatsoever. And for peanut, there have been 2 studies that looked at it. One showed an effect that made it better, and one showed an effect that made it worse. So avoiding overall, that probably avoiding foods during pregnancy probably has no effect at all for the risk factor for developing food allergies at all. What about avoiding foods when you're doing breastfeeding? So this is during lactation. So looking at atopic dermatitis, there were 2, this is a meta-analysis that got published. So looking from a couple years ago now, looking for atopic dermatitis, so wheezing while doing pregnancy or breastfeeding, again, made no difference whatsoever. And this is even looking at positive skin tests. This is avoiding milk or avoiding milk and egg or any combination. Does not matter. So there's really avoiding foods while during pregnancy probably has no effects. So we tell mothers now, eat what you like. It doesn't really matter. It's not going to affect one way or another. What about introducing foods? Now, this was the idea that we need to avoid foods later. So there's been lots of studies now and a couple randomized trials now ongoing looking at this question. So the first one, this was looking at children actually. The idea was to look at, does adding wheat early, this was a study done at National Jewish in the United States, in Denver, looking at adding wheat early the idea was looking at originally was done for celiac disease. They were looking at whether this could cause a factor for celiac disease if you gave wheat early. And they thought, and the person that did the study had asked, like, what were you thinking? He's like, oh, I was sure that when the people got wheat early, we'll be much more likely to have celiac disease. It made no difference whatsoever for celiac, had no effect, plus or minus. But they also looked at being allergic to wheat. So if you gave wheat early in the first 6 months of life compared to after 6 months, if you waited to after 6 months, you were 5 times more likely to have wheat allergy. Or even if you gave rice later, you were much more likely. Just adding foods later, after 6 months of life, you were much more likely to have food allergy compared to not. So it was suggesting that earlier is better. Now, what about milk allergies? This is a study by Yitzhak Katz out of Israel, and they followed 13,000 infants. So it's a huge study, and they followed this huge birth cohort. And if they ate a food, if they thought they had milk allergy, they would come in, they would get allergy testing, and then get a challenge to truly prove that they're allergic to milk. And they looked at when milk was introduced. So if you introduce milk really early, so gave them in the first month of life, they're really less likely to have it. If you gave it sort of in 3 to 6 months of day here, they were most likely, suggesting that there's a window that's bad, there's a window that's good, and everything else is sort of in between. So there is definitely some time frame. This is when most people give milk. It's probably bad. You really want to give it early on, or wait. What about peanuts? And peanut is a big issue in the United States. Interestingly, I heard this rare peanut allergy here in Argentina, which is fascinating. There's also rare peanut allergy in Israel. So Gideon Lack looked at the study. We looked at peanuts in sort of a matched cohort, so a Jewish population in England and the Jewish population in Israel. And they looked at about 5,000 families. In both, they looked at when they ate peanut and sort of how often they had peanut allergy. And this is sort of when they were eating food. There was no real difference in the reduction of milk, eggs, solids, breastfeeding, strong reduction, nutrient reduction, but they ate peanuts earlier, and they ate sesame seeds earlier. So blue bars is when they introduced sesame seeds or peanuts. In Israel, they eat peanuts. This is sort of why they eat peanuts early. They eat, this is bamba. Bamba is a teething food in Israel. So this is when babies are teething, they give them bamba. Bamba is basically these little pieces of things that basically are peanut cookies. So they have little pieces of peanut in them, and they just eat peanut really early on. And the idea was that you wanted to get the food in inside the mouth, not on the mouth. That are suggesting, at least in mice, if you put the food on a mouse, you really made a mouse really allergic. If you made the mice eat the food, they became less allergic. So wearing the food is probably the best way to make a mouse allergic. So that by giving the peanut, eating it early, so this is the group eating peanut allergy. So in England, it was much more likely, 6 times more likely to have peanut allergy, and 3 times more likely to have sesame allergy in England compared to the other foods, where milk was really no difference, egg was really no difference whatsoever. So in that eating peanut early was suggesting that would prevent food allergies. So now there have been a couple, this is the first of a randomized trial. There are 2 other large randomized trials now looking at early introduction, one from out of England by Gideon Lack, and the other out of Australia by, I think, Susan Prescott's doing the one out of Australia, looking at early introduction. So in this one, here they gave egg early. So they gave, when the kids was a double-blind study, it's a small study, we gave them egg powder or rice powder at the first 4 to 8 months of age. And if you gave egg early, so here they had less likely to have egg allergy compared to the patients who had rice early, suggesting again that it was protective one way versus the other. All right. So the other thing, just to finish up here, that eating things, not only what foods, but being diverse foods, that eating lots of things with fruits and vegetables and home-prepared foods, not the processed foods we all eat, seems to be protective, that more things are better. All right, so now just to end up here, what do we know? Just right on time. So allergies, asthma, allergic rhinitis, all sort of what we call non-communicable diseases have all risen in the last 100 years. And we think it's due to a decrease of infectious agents. We have a lot more infectious products going on. The question is, we know from mouse models that the changing the microbiome, changing parasitic infections makes it much more likely. Actually, I realized I should have been facing this way, too. I apologize to people over here. It makes things much more likely. But what also, it's probably much more complex than that. It's not only what we added, when we add things, the microbiome, got to be the right genetics. It's probably, the more I actually read about epigenetics, the plastics that we all, at least in the US, we microwave everything. All my kids come home, I stick food in the microwave and they eat it. Those little plastic containers has a lot of bisphenols, and they have they do great effects. They change your epigenetics really fast. So all those things. So it's a combination, and it's not one thing, but they're all rising. It's probably a combination of being too clean, eating the wrong foods, not pasteurizing everything, too much antibiotics, too much microwave, probably being inside too much, living on a computer, because vitamin D is probably a good thing, but you just need to be outside just a little bit. So all those things probably play a large role. And I will end there, and thank you for your attention.